Hi everyone again. Welcome to Chapter 8. This chapter is called An Introduction to Metabolism. And metabolism can mean a lot of different things. We can speak about metabolism at the macro level. We can speak about metabolism at the subcellular level. And we're going to talk about all those aspects of metabolism in this chapter, with an emphasis on the cellular stuff, but we have to start big and work our way down a little bit. In the really, really big picture of the cell, we have literally thousands of different kinds of chemical reactions going on and millions of individual reactions occurring every second inside the cell. That said, we can distill this down into some simple ideas. That it's energy flow, that we are taking energy from one form or one location and turning it into something else. We may be taking energy from one chemical bond and making another chemical bond. Taking energy from a chemical bond and generating a concentration gradient. That's what we mean by work. What we're doing is we're converting energy from one form into another, whether it's kinetic energy or another form of potential energy. We can even do this, we can even convert it to light in some cases, like in the instance of bioluminescence, which is more common than you might realize. It's more common than you might realize. It's actually quite a common phenomenon, even though it feels relatively unusual to us. But in the summertime, you'll see lightning bugs, fireflies. Or if you're lucky enough to be somewhere where you have phosphorescent algae, I was really, really lucky. There was a bay near where my sister got married where we were kayaking at night, and it was like this. It was like magic. It was absolutely amazing. You could stroke your paddle across the water and it would glow. Turns out that the protein, the enzyme that causes that bioluminescence, is right here. It's a phosphorescent protein, interacts with ATP down here in the active site. We're going to talk about aspects of enzymatics later on in this lecture as a part of this whole large phenomenon of metabolism. And again, the book starts with the big stuff. You can talk about metabolism writ large, the totality of an organism's chemical reactions, like that picture, like something like this, which is, useful. It helps you reflect, but this is not where we want to be. And I am going to expect more from you than just to say carbohydrates are fuel. We need to be able to break this down. Why? Because your patients need you to be able to break it down. Metabolism is actually an emergent property. It's interactions in individual situations, not just the totality. Totality is fine, but that's like a mechanic looking at your car when you take it in for a repair and going, well, that car doesn't work. Doesn't get us very far if we keep it at the totality level. We've got to break it down into the molecular level, and that's what we're going to do in this chapter. A few definitions for you. If we have a metabolic pathway, that's usually a multiple reaction pathway catalyzed by different enzymes. So we have an A starting molecule that then with an enzyme, is converted into something else, which is then can be converted and so forth. This is very, very common when we talk about what we call an individual metabolic pathway. Oftentimes we talk about reactants and products. We also talk about intermediates if we're getting from A to D in this case. And that's kind of what's going on here. I mean, you can take a picture like this, and what you see is if we follow, this is the citric acid cycle right here, these different steps are catalyzed by different enzymes. We start somewhere right around here. We move through these different reactions until we end up back right before, and then we're going to bring some more carbon in, again, to make ATP. Actually, we're going to make intermediates. But in any case, that's what's going on here. That's what's going on in all of these pathways. So immediately, just by understanding that fundamental of intermediates and products and reactants, you can begin to get a little bit of a toehold in something as scary as a picture like this. A few more definitions. If we are breaking things down in metabolism, we would call that a catabolic reaction, and almost all catabolic reactions cause some release of energy. When you break chemical bonds, Even if you're making new chemical bonds, you're almost always releasing energy. That's what we call an exergonic reaction. When there's some free energy left over that's released out into the environment. For instance, respiration. When we're breaking down glucose with oxygen, that is a catabolic pathway that liberates energy. Some of that energy we're going to use, be able to trap it. Some of that energy is going to be released as heat. With anabolic pathways, we're doing the opposite. We need energy, and usually that energy is trapped from catabolic pathways in order to put these molecules together to build larger, more complicated molecules, polymers. This is an anabolic reaction, and I always think anabolic steroids to build up your muscles. All right, for instance, let's say these are amino acids, we're making a peptide. That's an example of an anabolic pathway. That requires energy to be done. This can't happen normally on its own. It needs to have some sort of input of energy. And often we're coupling catabolic reactions with anabolic ones. Writ large, that's called bioenergetics. And that's about as far as we're going to go with bioenergetics. It's a lovely topic, and it's really good for corroboration. If you propose a mechanism or you say something's happening, the energy has to add up. I actually had I had a paper that I published a few years back where I was proposing something was going on, and the reviewers were like, well, the energetics, energetics doesn't quite add up. And we had to do a few more experiments to show that the energetics actually did. So it's a great topic. It's just probably beyond the scope of our course when it comes to calories and free gives energy and that sort of thing. If metabolism is energy flow, then what in fact is energy? Energy is one of those things we bounce around words all the time, every day of our lives. So what really is it? And here's a lofty definition, is the capacity to cause change. Well, la-di-da. What we're really talking about is motion. Motion. It can be macro motion. It can be subatomic motion, vibration of the atomic nuclei, or it could be the gravity that pulls Jupiter around the sun. It's all motion, and energy is the capacity to cause changes in motion. Just that simple. But it's very, very profound. It's just like the air we breathe. And so let's put motion right up here underneath there to keep that in mind. So this capacity to cause change doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but when you put it in terms of motion, whether it's electrons orbiting around atoms, or it's contracting a muscle, it's still motion. But it does exist in various forms, some of which can perform work, yeah, but it's motion, all right? It's different forms of motion. For instance, light. What happens is that's the motion of electromagnetic energy called photons, all right? Heat is the vibration of molecules and the impact of molecules rubbing against. It's a heat of friction in much of the case times. But again, it's motion. Chemical energy is just electrons moving from one atom to another. Kinetic energy, motion. That one's pretty obvious. Electrical energy, motion. Okay, it's still motion. And so here are some definitions for you, but again, think about that idea of motion. For instance, kinetic energy, it says it's associated with motion. That's true, but it's realized motion. So if we have potential energy down here, is energy that matter possesses because of its location or structure, when that motion is in fact imparted on that structure or whatever, then it becomes kinetic energy. Thermal energy, heat, that's a form of kinetic energy because it's atoms and molecules rubbing and bouncing around. Chemical energy is potential energy, but it is electrons that are trapped, and so their location and their structure make it potential energy. But we can convert from one form to another. For your own purposes, I would ask of you to think of an example of each type. We may try to come up with some examples in class, but try to think of an example of each type of these four. That way you have it in your head, just like you have resources waiting to be used. Having ideas is a great thing to have going into assessments. And here's just a picture in your book, just illustrating it from a relatively simple point of view in terms of potential energy and kinetic energy and lower potential energy and increasing potential energy, et cetera, et cetera. We're converting kinetic energy into potential energy with this swimmer climbing out of the water. This idea of energy transformation is known as thermodynamics, and it falls into line with bioenergetics. Thermodynamics is just a larger field of which bioenergetics would be a subset of. We often talk about isolated versus open systems. Isolated means that the energy flow is restricted to a given or very limited to a given set of objects and surroundings. In an open system, though, we have transferal between the surroundings and the object of interest. Organisms typically fall into the open system category unless we deliberately isolate them. And though the book talks about these things, I'm not going to worry too much about the laws of thermodynamics. You have a physics course, you're going to learn that. It's just that energy is transformed. It can't be created or destroyed. The E equals mc squared kind of stuff. You can convert energy to, matter to energy and vice versa, that sort of thing. Second law, the reason we would learn second law is because what happens is that energy sort of flows downhill. In fact, there are theories about time, about how time advances, and that time follows entropy. Time can speed up and slow down. That's law of relativity and that sort of fun thing. But in any case, we perceive time as the increase of entropy in the universe, shall we say. We're always releasing heat. We're always releasing energy out into the universe, and so energy tends to kind of flow downhill, thus increasing disorder. It's big stuff, but this is kind of what drives how reactions do what they do when chemical reactants interact with each other. So the biological equivalent of the first law of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed. The energy within the fish is being transferred into energy within the bear, with a little bit of heat given off. Okay, that's really what this is about. Is that the laws of energy in a biologic system must agree with the universal laws of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics, that we're increasing entropy as this bear runs. He's releasing chemical bonds. That's from originally from the molecules that he ate. And so what we have is increased disorder in the form of heat and products. Now, those last few pictures are examples of what we call a scalable concept. It's scalable because we can scale this down to the cell or even subcellular level. So like, for instance, that bear eating the salmon, as the cell ingests molecules, that's the same story. We're converting energy. As the cell metabolizes those molecules, energy can be changed. That's the second law. All right, that's the second law. But we have reactions that can occur spontaneously. What we mean by spontaneous is that there's enough energy already there. You don't have to add additional energy. There's enough energy in the system already. They can happen fast, they can happen slow. It's a question of whether they happen or not. And when they do happen, that means that there's enough energy for that to proceed with the reaction. On the other hand, and this is the idea of the second law, if we aren't putting in energy, there must be some increased disorder. The word entropy means disorder writ large, whether it's heat, whether it's smaller, lower energy molecules and more of them. Like, imagine this. Let's say a rock starts rolling down the hill. It's going to interact with the surface that it's rolling down and release heat. It may also start breaking up into smaller pieces which have less overall energy and more disorder. That's what we're talking about here. And I'm getting a little bit bored with this, so maybe we should start doing something that's real. But in any case, if you understand some of this, hopefully the more complex processes will also make sense for you. Let's start with Chapter 8 now, and let's get to the cellular level, shall we? We've got enough hand waving going on, but again, the things that are going on here have to obey the laws that we talked about in the previous slides. Okay, the past 15 minutes, everything that goes on here has to conform to that. And the main thing that we want to talk about is this idea of enzymes and chemical reactions, so what we call enzymatics. Hardly anything goes on in our body that doesn't involve some kind of enzyme of some kind at some point. Maybe gas exchange in your lungs doesn't involve enzymes, but it sure takes enzymes to get that gas there in the first place and then get the waste gases out. But let's just show you a simple example of why enzymes are so unbelievably important and why we should know about them if we want to be in healthcare or taking care of people. For instance, let's say we poke our finger with a sharp object. That stimulus may cause the conversion of certain molecules into a signal. And a second step here, catalyzed by an family of enzymes called cyclooxygenases, turns this signal into what's perceived as pain on our neurons. So this cyclooxygenase enzyme, particularly cyclooxygenase 2, converts these molecules into pain signals. And if we block cyclooxygenase 2 in particular, then we have no more pain. Well, guess what? Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, aspirin, Tylenol are all chemicals that inhibit the enzyme cyclooxygenase. And so by understanding enzymes, we have a big handle on medical therapeutics, because many or most all of the drugs that we use are inhibiting some kind of enzyme-like function, some sort of protein motion, protein interaction. We have even cured cancer by inhibiting certain kinds of enzymes. There's an enzyme out here called CML, and it interacts with the ABL kinase is what it's called, ABL, tyrosine kinase. Well, in any case, Gleevec, the drug Gleevec, can interfere with this interaction, with this enzymatic situation, and can actually cure certain kinds of leukemia, chronic myelogenous leukemia, by blocking the enzymes. That's how powerful this is. And this is what I call the anatomy of a chemical reaction. That if we have reactants here and we want to create products, oftentimes we need some kind of an energy input. If there's enough energy in the system to overcome this need for activation energy, then this reaction becomes spontaneous, as we talked about earlier. But there are some things about this that we need to understand. So here's our starting potential energy level. And when we get that rock rolling, it breaks up. That's entropy going on here, and we're releasing heat and that sort of a thing. And when we lose those chemical bonds and we have that heat, we now have products that are at a lower energy state. And that difference between the start and the finish, by the way, this is a standardized test question for MCATs and GREs and things. We call that the delta G. It's a Gibbs free energy. This happens to be an exergonic reaction. That's because there is less energy at the end. We have a negative delta G. We've lost energy to the universe, either in the form of heat or motion. And so this would be exergonic. If we turn it around, where we have reactants down here and we have to input a certain amount of energy to get us to here, this is an example of an endergonic reaction. It absorbs energy into the products, and so the products have a higher state of potential energy, usually in the form of chemical bonds in biologic situations. But let's get back to this original picture here, because it serves our purposes for understanding what we're going to see when it comes to enzymes. You often hear about enzymes as being catalysts. You often hear about them speeding up chemical reactions. Well, here's the real deal, and you're going to see this not only in this class, but you'll see this in 330 during the first part of the class. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions or make them spontaneous by reducing the amount of activation energy that's needed. And there are several ways they can do this, and we could study biochemistry about how enzymes can torque molecules, or they can bring two reactants close together, or they can create acidic or basic conditions. Lots of possibilities there. But the bottom line is the reason that they can make reactions more spontaneous or speed them up is because they're reducing the activation energy requirement, making them more likely to be spontaneous. Another way of saying this, and I've said this I've sort of alluded to this earlier, that when reactions are spontaneous, there's enough energy to make them go. So by adding an enzyme to a reaction scenario, we have now made this reaction more temperature sensitive. You hear what I said there? Temperature is kinetic energy. And so if we have enough energy to start the reaction, a spontaneous reaction, or a reaction that becomes more spontaneous, is more sensitive to the temperature. Okay? And so we can get reactions that occur at physiologic temperatures. It doesn't have to destroy the cell in order to get that reaction to go. We can light a pile of glucose on fire. You can have a pile of glucose, looks like table sugar. You can light it on fire. You can light sucrose on fire. Do that in a fireproof bowl, but you can do it. Well, we can't do that in a cell, right? That cell would be immolated by the fire that's released, you know, first of all in the activation energy, but then the energy that's released. So enzymes allow us to make reactions more spontaneous and allows them to be more temperature sensitive. So we can run them at physiologic temperatures. But there's more to this. There's more to this story. It's not enough just to get these reactions going. We have to be able to control them. We have to be able to stop them or slow them down. We don't want this ball to just roll out of control down here. We want it to roll in a nice controlled fashion so we can harvest all that energy. And enzymes can do that too. Yes, they can lower the energy requirement, but if we start lowering the amount of enzyme or changing it somehow so that it is not as active or it goes away, now that activation energy requirement becomes higher and the reaction becomes less spontaneous. So it's not just about getting the reactions to go at our physiologic temperatures. It's also allowing them to stop when we want to stop them. And that, my friends, is control. So we can not only accelerate and get reactions to go in our bodies, but we can also slow them down and stop them. And that's a major point that many people miss. We're so concerned about getting the reactions going in the first place, we forget about the fact that we got to stop them. We don't want to make too much stuff. Those calories are hard to come by. All right? So control as well as promote. We can promote the reactions going, and we can control them by controlling the controllers. We control the enzymes, we can control the reaction. So I'm going to stop right there. So that's the end of part 1. We will pick up with part 2, where we're going to talk more about enzymes and how they do their thing in the idea of metabolism. So thank you for your time. And as always, please bring your questions. I know that many students will suffer not clarifying something. Don't be that student. We have too many of those. Don't be that student. Ask me questions. I will be thrilled to answer your questions for you. And if you don't want to do it in the scenario of class, you can wait till after class. That's fine too. But reach out to me, and I'll do my best to help you as best I can. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you again soon.